Hey folks, how you going? Another installment. Happy botanising and all that. Uh, Whacked together this video today, and I'm pretty game to tackle it. I can tell you. This is the fourth lecture on, if you can call it that, on Sydney eucalypts. And we were still on the sandstone country, sticking with the sandstone, but the stringybarks might make for a good transition from the sandstone to the shale or the alluvium. I think I've covered the sandstone eucalypts I wanted to cover, and yeah, these guys might make a good transition. On this video, trying to keep them short, I'm just giving a rundown of the notoriously difficult stringybarks and covering about 3 species, and then I'll do a second video with more, and once I get a few more photos as well. But I've put that heading up there. It almost comes with a, you know, dun dun dun. It's a challenging group. It's good once you get to know them and get confident with them, but they are challenging, and any ecologist or botanist will tell you that they've sort of been historically difficult, and we do wrestle with them. But you can get familiar with some with a bit of practice, and you'll always probably find that there'll be areas of New South Wales I'm talking about where they do get a bit tricky. So let's go through and see what we've got. They're a common group of eucalypts, the stringybarks. They'll have species occurring on a range of soils, so sandstone, shale, alluvium, mainly in woodland and forest. You can get them possibly in heath. Yeah, you'll get them in heathlands as well sometimes, or maybe mallee heathlands, lateritic outcrops as well. And I just say here that, you know, the scribbly gums are typically upslope most of the time, but the stringybarks can be upslope and downslope. There's even some species that in their particular habitats, they'll happily sit on top of the ridge and they'll happily go right down to the creek line in the gully. I'm thinking of one in some inland areas, Eucalyptus macrorinca, for example. So then, you know, you can come across stringybarks commonly in a wide range of habitats. That's my main point there. They're known to be a very difficult group to confidently identify the species. There are likely populations of intergrades and intermediates. That doesn't necessarily mean hybrids, and I won't go into that, but some of those might be hybrid swarms. Just you know, populations of trees that are intermediate between 2 species and are a bit hard to tell. There's been some historic lumping and splitting, and it's often difficult to tell a species at first glance. You normally have to have a pretty good look at it to tell what it is and not be so lazy like me. Remember the lazy botanist here. Often we want buds, fruit, as well as adult and juvenile leaves to make a sound decision, and you combine that with habitat and records. That's normally what we're looking for. You know, I might say there with Eucalyptus teraticornis, for example, which I haven't done yet, but you might just pick up the buds and go, yep, I'm happy that's teraticornis. You might pick up the fruit of seabori and go, yep, that's Eucalyptus seabori, all good. But with a stringybark, you normally want to get a hold of all of this to make a sort of more solid decision. You can do that you could argue that with any eucalypts, but with the stringybarks, I totally emphasize that. You can have more than one stringybark in some habitats. I've had plenty of sampling plots in a particular areas where you can get, you know, 2 stringybarks together. That makes it very interesting and very challenging. You got to pay attention, especially when you move from, you know, micro location to micro location across the site. I'm thinking of some really large farms I've been on with some undulating country, ridge top and creek line. You can get a lot. Trees can often be small, juvenile, and without fruit in some habitats. I don't know what it is about some stringybarks, but I know some particular areas. I'm talking about the Southern Highlands, really, New South Wales, where you can have nice mature seabori and piperita and maybe Corymbia gymifera, and then you've got these really small sort of sapling stringybarks. And I don't know if it sort of means all the stringybarks were cut down at one point in time, maybe 50 years ago or more, maybe. and they're only just sort of regenerating in the habitat. I'm just not sure, but sometimes I find stringybarks really miserable to get material off. All you get is foliage. You might get juveniles. You're scratching around looking for fruits on the ground, and sometimes you just can't get them. To me, they're a group of eucalypts where it's just a bit harder to get fertile material some of the time. It helps to have a pole saw if you're going to be getting into a lot of stringybark country. History of lumping and splitting. I like this, with some botanists believing in some and not others. So some botanists deciding that there's no difference between two particular species or taxa, and they'll lump them together. Just check Euclid versus New South Wales Flora online. For example, Euclid is lumping Eucalyptus oblonga in with Globoidia. New South Wales Flora Online still recognises it. I believe in Eucalyptus oblonga. I think it's a tree that can be recognised in particular habitats. That's in this lecture. Globoidia is going to be in the next one. But Euclid, they've just lumped it together and said, and they might do that with a few others as well. So I've been involved in some recent collecting of the stringybarks across New South Wales. The geneticists are telling me that there's no real difference between a lot of them. There's sort of a broad sort of spectrum of variation, but we just try and get familiar with the species that are recognised, especially when we're doing that plant community type assessment and that sort of thing. New species and taxa continue to be found. So you keep getting ecologists, botanists who say, I've got a new stringybark in this particular corner of New South Wales. It's different. It's going to be a new species, so they're just a group that keeps throwing up variability and possible new species as well. But I'd be very hesitant, precautionary in jumping ahead and saying I'm going to recognise a new stringybark, because they're highly variable. So stringybark, we've got long fibres of, they're described as grey to brown, tan, red bark, which, you can pull off. You can pull off in these massive strips, or, these 1 metre, 2 metre strips. So that's what a stringybark is sort of defined as. And the bark usually goes right up to the upper branches. So it's not a half bark. It goes right up to the branch tips in most cases, just persists right up there. And it doesn't usually shed. You don't get stringybark shedding a truckload of bark like a lot of the other eucalypts or the gums or some of the ones that are known to decorticate. It tends to hold these on. It doesn't go through an annual, dramatic shedding process, not that I can see anyway. It might just shed very, very small fibres throughout the year. I'm not sure, but they tend to hold their bark, hold onto it, and don't really drop a lot, unless an animal or someone like me walks up and starts pulling bits off. The adult leaves are often concolorous to slightly discolorous. To me, they're often concolorous. Now, that's a really helpful tip for a stringybark. Remember in the last video, the mahoganies, which can look the chunks can look very similar, they're strongly discolorous most of the time, or all the time. So the mahoganies are strongly discolorous leaves. Well, when you get hold of the stringybark leaves, they're pretty much concolorous. They might be slightly discolorous, just a slightly different tone of green on one side. But that's one of the things to latch onto for a stringybark. The second thing to latch onto is the leaves have a distinct oblique or uneven base. And I'll show you that. It's really defining feature for stringybarks. Other eucalypts can throw leaves with this uneven base, but remember, you look for the representative condition. You look for the representative overall picture. You don't just look at one eucalypt leaf off a tree. You get about 10 leaves and have a look at, 10, 15 leaves if you have to. But the stringybarks have this pretty consistent oblique base, and that's, a really good feature to look at. The juvenile leaves are often discolorous, and so just latch onto that feature there. So they're going from this discolorous state to this concolorous state in the adult phase. They can be strongly discolorous, and often if you get a sprig or a branch of stringy bark juvenile foliage, this really helps as well. They've got this sort of scabbard texture, or this sort of sandpaper-like texture, if you like, a bit like a plant like, you know, Herbaceae aspera, something like that. They're very rough a lot of the time. They're not all like that, but a lot of them are. And they have this hispid texture. When you see a stringy bark seedling coming up in the ground, it's got this very sandpapery or hispid or asperous sort of texture. And that tells you you've got stringy barks around. When you see these, you know, you feel and see these hispid, scabbard seedlings, juvenile growth, either in the ground or on the tree. I think it's a presence of glands, these sort of protrusions. I think they're glands that's causing this sort of sandpapery texture. Some species have conspicuous undulating juvenile leaves. We'll look at that. I haven't got that in this video, but we'll look at that in some future species. These really strongly undulating or wavy margin leaves on the juveniles. The umbellasters, usually they're in at least 9, 11 or to 15. Some plants are described as having 7s, but you don't really get a stringy bark with the buds in 7s. Not typically. They're normally well and truly in the 11 to 15 range, 9, getting up to that much. They're a genuine, you know, numerous cluster. So not usually in 7s. And the capsules, the fruits, many species have distinctive clustered and rounded capsules, sort of squashed in on each other or just generally clustered. Not all of them, but most of them. And we're going to look at that too, a typical stringy bark sort of feature. So we associate all that with our stringy barks, and, you know, it can be easy to say, yeah, I've got a stringy bark, but I'm just not sure what species it is. I'm battling there, but I definitely know it's a stringy bark. So if you get that far, that's great. Here's the ones I'm going to try and go through. Remember, this talk, I'm only going to go through the first 3 because we're still on the Hawkesbury sandstone country. So I'm just going to try and cover these 3 and then go through these. But if I'm working around Sydney and the wider Sydney area and possibly a bit further afield, I don't know, Hunter Valley, Southern Tablelands, Southern Highlands, maybe I'll go a little bit inland to Goulburn or Bathurst or something like that. They're my stomping grounds, and I know there'll be some stringy barks here or stringy barks that aren't there from, say, the North Coast. The North Coast, the Northern Tablelands, the Northwestern Slopes. You can get a few more up there as well. But if I'm in the general Sydney area and a bit further afield, this is what we're looking at. So Capitulata oblonga, which Euclid treats as in with Globoidia, Sparsifolia, Globoidia, Eugenioides, Agglomerata, Macrorhyncha, Muelleriana, Blackslandii obliqua, which is one of my favourites. And I just threw in this one, which I probably won't cover, but it's a threatened species in Sydney, and that's Eucalyptus camphildii, which, yeah, is on the listed threatened list, I guess. Just with that oblique leaf base, that uneven leaf base, my understanding is the first stringy bark to be looked at, you know, early on by a European was called Eucalyptus obliqua due to that uneven leaf base. And it's an absolutely crap name because they've all got that feature. And that's just what happened with early botany in Australia was, you know, someone saw something and gave it a name, not realising that if you look at all the other ones, which probably hadn't been described yet, they've all got that feature. So that's what that obliqua refers to, is that oblique leaf base. So these are the ones you get to know and love in the Sydney area, and like I said, a little bit further afield. I'm going to link back to my previous talks. If you are getting into country where you say, oh, I think this is Eucalyptus rossii, this is the inland scribbly gum. I saw Dan's video and I've looked it up. This is where Eucalyptus rossii, I think, is we're starting to see it here in a bit of inland New South Wales. Well, if you've got a stringy bark growing with it, your Eucalyptus rossii, it's probably bound to be Eucalyptus macrorhyncha. That's a red stringy bark which is in the inland areas of New South Wales. and will happily grow with something like Eucalyptus rossii on the ridge tops, and will happily grow with other trees like Eucalyptus melliodora down in the gullies as well. So you can link some to some habitats and some some inland parts or different parts of New South Wales. So I think that's sort of the point of the next slide here. Yeah, so what I've tried to do, and this might just confuse the hell out of everything, is sort of group them for similarity and consideration when you're in particular habitats. So Hawkesbury sandstone, northwestern Sydney, southern Sydney. These are the ones you got to be sort of thinking about. Capitulata, oblonga, Camphildii, sparsifolia, and you can't really write off Gleboidia, not in the southern parts of Sydney on the sandstone and into the southern highlands where the Hawkesbury sandstone keeps going. You can't really write that off, but they're the ones I'm sort of, you'd be wrestling with. And wondering which ones you have. If you get into the inland areas of New South Wales, tablelands, into the western slopes, southern highlands, and I should say there, maybe you're punching through the Hunter Valley. You're going to punch through the Hunter Valley towards, let's say, Cessnock, or you might go further up towards Tamworth or something like that. These are the ones you'll probably be wrestling with, and there's a few rare ones up that way too, which I'm not going to cover. There's a few Stringybarks up there that are rare. These are the ones you're probably going to wrestle with. Have I got Eugenioides, or is it Macarinca? Maybe it's Gleboidia, maybe it's Sparsifolia. Sparsifolia punches right up there as well. So these have sort of got bigger ranges, and a lot of these have sort of got limited ranges in Sydney. If I'm in the Southern Highlands, northwest Sydney, Goulburn, okay, I'm thinking about Gleboidia and Agglomerata. They can grow together and hang out there a bit. Well, if I'm in northwest Sydney, I've got to chuck in Sparsifolia as well. That's going to be in the mix there too. So that might have been a little typo there, but I might have meant to say Southern Highlands, Goulburn. I'm definitely going to be wrestling with these two. And Macarinca would go in there as well. So, yeah, so sorry, this one should probably be a bit of a repeat of that one. But Gleboidia, Agglomerata, they can hang out together. Probably throw Eugenioides in there as well. And definitely Macarinca and Sparsifolia, they'd be in there too. I did say this one was going to be confusing. I haven't got that bit quite right. This bit's right. South Coast, Kangaroo Valley, starting at the Wollongong area and going down the south coast, let's say Bateman's Bay. You're probably going to wrestle with these two and possibly get them confused, Eugenioides and Muelleriana. Muelleriana is a real south coast, Kangaroo Valley thing. I say this, if you're ever driving out of Albion Park and you go up that beautiful Macquarie Pass to Robertson, that's a beautiful area, one of my favourite in New South Wales, really. Muelleriana is right there at the bottom of Macquarie Pass. It's right there on the side of the road. And when I saw them, I thought they were Eugenioides. So you can get those two a bit mixed up. Southern Highlands, Wombeyan Caves Road, Canyon Lee, this is my stomping grounds. I battle a bit with Macarinca versus Blackslandii versus Gleboidia. They're all sort of there, and I might have to look out for Eugenioides as well. And Agglomerata would still be a possibility. So, I'm just sort of having these mix and matches, what you've sort of got to think about when you go into these sort of areas. And Southern Highlands, Eucalyptus obliqua, you shouldn't get that one confused with any other one because the fruits are very different. And I want to show that one in a video. It's one of my favourites, obliqua. The fruits aren't typical stringybark fruits. They're very different. They don't even look like stringybark. So we'll have a look at that one when we can. But that's in the Southern Highlands, and obliqua can be a massive tree on volcanic soil, basalt, shale, and it can get on sandy country as well. But so that was a bit of an attempt there to group them sort of together, and where this is reflected, this sort of grouping that I've tried to come up with, probably needs a lot of correction. Let's say, for example, you look up records in a particular spot in Sydney and you go, there's a lot of Eucalyptus oblonga records here. where I am in this particular part of Sydney? Well, all I'd say to you is look up the Eucalyptus capitulata records and you might find they're in the exact same location. And then you might look up some Eucalyptus sparsifolia records and they're in the exact same location. So the battle I've had with a lot of these is, might be down here, for example. Let's say I look up the records of Eucalyptus blaxlandii and it's in the location where I am. And I go, great, I reckon these trees are Eucalyptus blaxlandii. And then I look up Eucalyptus glabroidia and they're in the exact same location as well, or pretty much the exact same location. Recorded possibly at 2 different dates, 2 different times. And then I might look up Eucalyptus macarinca and they've been recorded nearby as well. So this is sort of can be reflected when you look up the records. Look up Bionet, look up AVH. If you're in New South Wales, look up the Wildlife Atlas, all that sort of thing, Atlas of Living Australia, and you'll see that you might get multiple of these recorded at the same spot. And then you think, oh God, which one is it? I'm going to have to get everything I can and make a good assessment here. So that's what that slide was about, just trying to group them together a bit. And straight into it. So if we're going to get familiar with them, it's best to sort of, walk into the shallow water before we jump into the deep water. And I reckon this guy is as good a place as any to start. Good old Eucalyptus capitulata, which I think is a really distinctive and easy one to get to know on the sandstone country, normally on the ridge tops, the higher grounds. This is just a tree on the Princes Highway at Sylvania, a remnant tree. We sort of got a bit of lateritic outcrop here, but it's right on the ridge. And you can get them in sandy, swampy country as well, especially Lake Macquarie is where I know them, around Gosford, Newcastle there. Yeah, I've seen the largest trees I've ever seen in sort of sandy, swampy vegetation, sort of lychee stuff. Some nice big capitulatas there. Not too far from the ocean most of the time. 20 metres or so. It's called the brown stringybark. Persistent bark, grey to red-brown, persistent to upper limbs. Adult leaves with the oblique base and very thick texture. Now, I know this is comparative. And you say, well, Dan, compared to what? But we just got a range of leaf textures in the stringybarks. And one of the ones that sort of kicks in is if you get Eucalyptus eugenioides, they've got very papery, thin leaves. And it's a bit of a default identification sometimes for eugenioides. If you combine it with habitat and the fruits and that sort of thing, the leaves have got a very papery texture. Well, capitulata, they're the opposite. They've got a really thick, genuine texture. It's like the leaf is about, getting towards a millimetre thick or something like that. It's very, very sturdy, almost sort of plasticky like in texture. Concolorous, mid to dark green. Sometimes I think they're sometimes bluey green in particular habitats, but I'll get onto that later. They could be bluey green when they're possibly intermingling with oblonga, or if they're bluey green, they might be oblonga. But this tree here's got genuine green leaves, genuine mid-green to dark green. 18 centimetres long, 3.5 centimetres wide. The juveniles are 8 centimetres long, 4 centimetres wide. They are scabrous for the early leaves at least. They're not usually undulating and they are discolorous. So they got a nice, this particular tree has really fat leaves on it, this capitulata. I've always collected samples of it for years. It's just up the road from my place. So it's a nice tree. It's got a strongly coastal distribution, endemic to New South Wales. Nerriga, that's down, towards sort of Goulburn, Canberra area. And then it goes up to Karua on the north coast of New South Wales. It doesn't go inland very far. And it's goes up the coast of New South Wales, and it's strongly concentrated around Sydney. So south coast to north coast. That's just a repeat there. This is what I'm talking about oblique leaf bases. So just have a look at that. Strongly uneven base. So just one side of the leaf is uneven compared to the other side. And that's a typical stringy bark feature. So just look for that. They're nice and glossy, but it's an oblique leaf base that we're looking at. I think I've turned the leaves over here just to show they're a similar colour on both sides. Pretty concolorous. And the oblique leaf base. I collected these leaves today off that tree and photographed them, and here they are. So just check all those out. Representative samples all off the one specimen. The beautiful uneven leaf base. Excuse me. Then I turned them over and you get the same deal there. So that's what you're looking for in stringy bark. Again, get representative samples. And like I said, you can get a leaf of Eucalyptus piperita, and it might be doing that. That's okay, just check multiple samples. It's in the stringy barks where they're doing it really consistently, really strongly. So just make sure you take your time to have a good look. That's a really miserable specimen of juvenile leaves, but I had this photo just put away for a job. This is what I associate with capitulata juveniles. They get pretty fat pretty quickly. There's not a lot of sign of undulation in the juveniles. And it's sprigs like this that you want to get along with everything else you get, along with the adult foliage, fruits, buds. You want to get these as well. So get your pole saw, cut those off, make sure you take them with you. That's what I associate with capitulata. Nice and fat, mid-green, ovate to maybe elliptic, maybe a little bit falcate. And they just don't look like something like Eugenioides or Glaboidia. They're just a fair bit different. That's an example of stringy bark buds, nice and yellow. Again, normally, you know, they're in that 9 to 15, getting towards that number. Always got this nice sort of yellow tone. They're normally sessile, meaning they don't have a lot of pedicel obvious, but they can have a pedicel to about 2 mil. And they're about 8 millimeters long, and they tend to have a pointed opercula or pointed calyptra. Where these stringy bark buds differ, and this becomes very important, the shape of them, the shape of the calyptra. Some of them can be scurfy, they can be covered in a wax. Some of them can be glossy, like they're covered in a sort of resin. And some of them have more of a rounded calyptra, and some of them have more of a pointy calyptra. And normally the calyptra is very short. It's not very long on there. And here they've got a nice flattened peduncle, which is sort of holding the whole thing. But each individual bud doesn't have much of a pedicel. That's a typical appearance for stringy bark buds. That's how they come across. This is from another tree, but I'm just assuming this is more of a maturation zone. Maturation stage. So here the operculum is starting to lengthen out a bit. And I think it gets to a point where, excuse me, it becomes about as long as the hypanthium. So I might have missed that detail, but the calyptra becomes about as long as the hypanthium, but it tends to maintain that sort of rounded shape. They can get a bit pointed at the ends, a bit conical, have a little bit of a sharp point. And there's other species that are sort of more rounded. But capitulata's got a pointed opercula. And that's sort of the more mature stage there that they've moved on to. This tree was also in flower. And I'm just sort of showing that when you take down the flowers, you know, you've got these sort of structures now happening. This would be immature fruit, moving on to the image, you know, to the really immature fruit, fertilized flowers, moving on to the fruit stage. So bits like this probably aren't going to be that helpful. It's just in between, you know, flower, buds and fruit. But you can get structures like that as well. Still note the leaves and what they're doing. But you just get these nice cream flowers. They can flower pretty heavily. They can look nice. They're down in sort of the leaf axils and well down the branches, so they're more axillary. But just nice cream flowers there. And then you get these beautiful fruits, and these are sort of one of the defining features. Here's a stringybark, typical stringybark fruit. They're clustered. They're clustered in these balls, or these, you know, what would you call them? Clusters, basically. And they show varying degrees of sort of being flattened, like they've been sort of compressed, and they squash in on each other. And this is what we love about stringybark fruits. They're sort of pretty distinctive. Capitulata has fruit on the large side. It's sort of up the larger end of the scale. They can be to 12 millimeters wide. And they well and truly squash in on each other. So what hits you with capitulata is how big they are and how much they squash in. Another one that aligns with this is agglomerata, the blue leaf stringybark. Those two trees don't really hang out in the same habitat. Not really. I can't think of anywhere where they might, but it's possible, but it would be very limited. But capitulata and agglomerata, they really get the squashing going on, and they well and truly have the fruit, you know, bumping up against each other like this. They've got this beautiful tan colour, as you can see. These beautiful tan hues. It's something I look for with capitulata, and it's beautiful. It almost looks like, you know, someone's painted it, or it's been polished, or it's going to go into a bit, it's been woodworked or something like that. They're quite nice, and you can see 4 valves here that are about to open up. So that's your typical stringybark fruit. When you've got these, you know, fused clusters, or fused fruit in a cluster is what I should say, that's when you know you've got a stringybark. If you remember back to the mahogany fruit, they were separate. They weren't sort of touching each other at all. They're totally separated. And we could go through many eucalypts where the fruits are separated. They're not touching each other at all. But these guys, they like to sit on top of each other. 12 millimeters wide, flattened hemispherical, 7 millimeters long, densely clustered, nice tan color in maturation stage. And this is what they look like once they're done. Once they're done and the seeds have gone, the valves are opened. It's saying the valves are rim level to exerted. That's what they look like. So you can find them on the ground looking like that. And you got to have a bit of a stab on what they are. So that's Eucalyptus capitulata. I think it's a good one to start on. Large fruits, thick textured leaves, sandstone ridge tops, a lot of Hawkesbury sandstone outcrop, possibly in things like wet heath and swampy woodlands, and very limited distribution in the sort of Greater Sydney area and New South Wales to a point. I didn't put my map in, I'm afraid. I should have done that. But it should be one you can get familiar with. And I'm moving on to a very similar species called oblonga. I'm starting to get a dry throat. Okay, this is a sandstone stringybark, or stringybark. Just note that Euclid treats it, it has lumped it in with Globoidia. So it doesn't, they don't believe in Eucalyptus oblonga. Like I said, I reckon I believe in it. I reckon I can tell it when I see it in an environment. It's very similar habitat to capitulata, and it might even hang out with capitulata. I don't really see it hanging out with Globoidia. It hangs out more with capitulata. But generally, to me, the leaves have a very blue-green appearance. They're always a bit bluey-green, and this particular example I'm focusing on from the northern suburbs of Sydney, I just saw the leaves were bluey-green. They were nowhere near as fat and large as the capitulata I've got up the road, and the capitulata's in Sutherland Shire where I am. The fruits are smaller, and it just tends to hang out in these sort of wetter, sort of sandstone heathy sort of areas in this particular part of the world anyway. And where I think I've seen oblonga historically, it's sort of near a wet heath or close to a wet heath. That might not be the case all the time, but that's what I associate it with. You can see the big lumps of stringybark hanging down. 15 metres tall. Often found in sandstone woodland heath, as well as sandy swampy country, wet heath shrubland, as well as sand dunes. I have seen it on sand dunes around areas like La Perouse in Sydney. Strong Sydney distribution, Gosford to Nowra, and there's now known to be a disjunct population in Oxley Wild Rivers on the northern tablelands. That's well and truly separated, and someone reckons they've got it there. So this is a complication that the stringybarks keep throwing up. This is a plant I collected for submission to the New South Wales Herbarium. Now, I'm not going to criticise them at all, not at all. But when I put these specimens in, they eventually came back identified as part oblonga, part capitulata. So that's just what they came back as. But to me, they were just different from the typical capitulata. But I think this would be good enough for oblonga. Oblique base, concolorous, adult leaves. PlantNet says 9, Euclid says 14 for Gleboidia. So we'd sort of put that in. 4 centimetres wide, green, glossy, concolorous. These didn't look glossy to me. They were more of a dull greeny blue out in the sun. So that's why I collected it. It was the colour of the leaves and the fruits that really, attracted me sort of to it. Scabbard juveniles to 10 centimetres long, 4.5 centimetres wide, a bit like capitulata. They've got a thickish texture, maybe not as thick as capitulata, but they don't feel thin or papery at all. They've still got a bit of a thickish texture on them. Just showing the buds there. I sort of had a range of bud sizes. That was throwing me as well. Some buds a lot bigger than other buds. I just wondered what was going on. But you can see the same sort of bud structure there. That one's really pointed, and that one's really pointed as well. Umbelasters, 7 to 15, usually 11 to 15. So they're sort of saying that you might get 7. I just think it might be a bit unusual. Pedicels to 2 millimeters long, yellow, and again they got the conical opercula at the top. Fruits are smaller than E. capitulata, but similar to 9 mil wide, 8 mil long, hemispherical to globose. And these are the fruits I got off this particular oblonga. Again, I look for the nice tan colouring, but they don't seem to be as big and they don't seem to be as squashed in on each other like that capitulata was. I mean, that was really squashed in, right? These seem to be a bit different. So they're just a bit separated, not quite squashing each other. They're on the sandstone country. You'd associate that more with Gleboidia or Sparsifolia, perhaps. And that's just another shot of an umbelaster I got there too. So that's what I was getting in the fruit. Pretty good for oblonga. And look, I borrowed this photo just so you can see a bit more variation. This is from the Northern Beaches Herbarium. Hopefully I can use the photo. Again, they don't seem to be quite as squashed in on each other. They're smaller. And yeah, again, even there, I reckon I can see the bluey green sort of leaves. They've just got a good bit of blue in them. And I don't really believe in the green and glossy. I don't believe in that, but it might just be different people's eyes. They just got a nice blue hit in the sun, but that's Eucalyptus oblonga. So whether they're aligned with capitulata or Gleboidia, just have a go and see if you can discern oblonga out there. Sparsifolia, last one for the talk. This is a tricky one for me. I just find it hard to identify. I've collected it from people's records where I think the leaves are just too fat to be Sparsifolia, but that's what people have recorded it as. It's a hard one. I just think it's hard. There's definite parts of the world where I know it from and we can latch on to and know it from. I just think it's a hard one, and I've had a bit of nightmare with this one just because I've had difficulty sort of picking it. But dry sclerophyll woodland and forests on sandy soils, sandstone to laterite, inland woodland areas, usually on sandy soils and rocky areas. Doesn't really get on the enriched country. It tends to be on the poor country. It goes as far south as Yerrinbul, Mittagong, and then it extends northwest through the Hunter Valley to the Pilliga Scrub. So it punches right out there. So if you're going to be in the Hunter Valley, If you're going to be around, I think, Tamworth maybe, if you're going to be northwest Sydney, and even if you're getting down here to Yarranbull, Mittagong, where I go, you got to consider it that it might be around. Persistent bark, grey to red-brown, persistent to upper limbs. Adult leaves, green, glossy to 14 centimetres long. They're only meant to be 22 millimetres wide. So that's the thing about sparsifolia. They're only meant to be narrow. And I just see some trees where I go, I reckon you're too fat. You get into 3 centimetres or more. So that's where I battle. Concolorus. Juveniles are scabbard to 5 centimetres long, only 0.4 centimetres or 4 millimetres wide. Discolorous glossy green. So again, we watch for that. Those juvenile leaves, we go, aha, brilliant. But again, I reckon I've seen juvenile leaves on sparsifolia that are a lot fatter than that. But that's my problem, and maybe I wasn't in what I thought was sparsifolia. Here's some habitat. This is South Maroota in northwest Sydney. This is a place I know them from really well. Here we've got a little bit of what was mapped as shale sandstone transition forest, a bit of Mittagong formation, and then down here we've got a genuine Hawkesbury sandstone gully. You've got trees like Corymbia eximia, Angophora hispida. There's no Angophora costata here, but I think there was Piperita further down the hill, and I think there's the odd scribbly gum around here too. But this is a ridge right up the top of the sandstone ridge. There's private properties along this road here. And this is sparsifolia. This is sparsifolia hanging out here nice and happily at this particular site. It's sort of easy to identify, and there's a lot of records here. Terrible photo. It's from years ago. There's a scribbly gum. We got a little bit of soil deposit over the sandstone here. That's just the front garden of the house next door. These are rural residential blocks. What I'm trying to show is the narrow leaves. The generally weeping narrow leaves of sparsifolia. That's how we start to pick them. They've just got these sort of weeping narrow leaves, and hence the species name and the common name, narrow-leaf stringybark. So you got to start watching for that if you think you got sparsifolia. Here's a tree here, typical stringybark, and just look at those leaves there. That's what you really want to get for sparsifolia. Well under, what did they say, 2.2 centimetres wide. Hopefully that's what you get, but I just don't think you get that everywhere. Bit complicated for me, but that's a good shot there. We were more than happy that these were exhibiting as sparsifolia. This was another site I did up the Putty Road, pretty much at Putty, so going on up there into the Hunter Valley. This is really strong sparsifolia country, and most ecologists who will work here will automatically say these are sparsifolia. I've got Hawkesbury sandstone outcrop. I've got things like Angophora costata. I had an ironbark, Eucalyptus bayeriana, probably bayeriana or cribra, Syncarpia glomulifera. I also had Eucalyptus punctata, and then you've got all these stringybarks going through. Now the stringybarks in this particular case could have been agglomerata. That's sort of good agglomerata country, but in this particular case they were sparsifolia. So that's a sort of habitat it'll hang out in. This is the northwest of Sydney. That's a repeat. That's the buds. I've had to borrow this one from Euclid. That's typically what the buds will look like. 9 to 15 on pedicels to 3 mil long. So they might be calling that the pedicel there, not as sessile as capitulata. So that might be the stalk. Beaked opercular, they're smooth. So they're smooth, they're not scurfy or covered with a wax or covered with little protrusions. Some of them are in the stringybarks. And the fruits, it's a 0.7 centimetres wide, 0.5 centimetres long. Valves are reported as near rim level or enclosed. I had a little bit of a problem with that. So at this Putty Road site, I picked these up. And it was one of those jobs where the vegetation mapping and people's previous flora surveys on this site, which I was given, were all saying they were sparsifolia. So I just sort of ran with it, and there's a lot of records there as well. But these are the fruits I picked up off the ground, and that's probably what sparsifolia is going to look like. If you compare it to Euclid photos, it's very similar. But as far as I can see there, and I reckon it's really showing on that one there, they're exerted valves. You know, to me, they're exerted. So Euclid and New South Wales Flora are reporting rim level or enclosed. To me, that and that and that and that and that, man, that's exerted. That's totally exerted. So whether these were from possibly a glomerata or whether they're from sparsifolia, like I said, the images on Euclid are very similar. They're showing these slightly exerted valves. So it might just be one of those things that needs a bit of a review from someone. They might say, well, sometimes they're exerted as well, because I don't think they're enclosed. But hopefully I'm giving you the right photo there for what sparsifolia come across as. Just a bit smaller. They're not really compacted on each other. They're going to have a little bit of a pedicel. So just watch out for that. Here was a job where I was totally satisfied that I had sparsifolia. This is right on the southern end of the range. This is Bargo, down the Hume Highway there, getting into the Southern Highlands. But this is a big farm at Bargo. And I'm seeing these stringybarks. They've got very narrow canopy, very narrow. And then I'm finding this on the ground and picking that up. And I go, oh, I reckon that's beautiful sparsifolia. Narrow, there's your stringybark buds, typically. You get in the oblique leaf bases, and they're happily staying under that, 22 millimeter width. So in this particular case, I was happy. I said, I'm happy for these to be sparsifolia, happy to call it. So you do get that sometimes. You just got to look out. I just don't know over the range how sort of consistent it is in the leaf width. I'm just a bit worried about that. You can't see that one very well, but that was a sparsifolia in the distance. Really genuine stringybark here all the way up, and the nice narrow canopy when you get up to it and underneath it. And there were records for sparsifolia here, not very far away from this Bargo site. So I was happy with that. Just a repeat, I think, and just the last slide. I stopped to get a sparsifolia collection at a place called Capertee, if you know that area. Capertee Valley, going up the road there to Mudgee from Lithgow. Yeah, that's the road, isn't it? From Mungo to Lithgow to Mudgee. And you'll go through Capertee, and there was a whole heap of sparsifolia records, and I pulled over. But the other one I'll just give you towards the end here is Tenella, Eucalyptus tenella. So at the exact same spot at this big picnic stop on the side of the road, there's a heap of sparsifolia records, and there's a heaps of Tenella records. Tenella is a valid taxon recognised by Euclid and New South Wales Flora. It's got a sort of patchy distribution through New South Wales, not overly big, but it sort of goes from north to south. I think it goes down into the Southern Highlands and goes north to maybe the Hunter Valley or somewhere like that. Very narrow leaves, and when you look at these stringybarks, the canopy is incredibly narrow. So I collected this as Eucalyptus sparsifolia, and I don't think I ever found out whether it was or not, but this is what the juvenile leaves were doing. So with our description of sparsifolia, this is what you should be getting with the juvenile leaves. So if you're seeing nice narrow juveniles like this, that aligns with sparsifolia, but it also aligns with this one called Tenella. So just look for that one out there. They're very similar. I think Tenella might have slightly different fruits and buds, and possibly the leaves are even narrower than they are for sparsifolia. But they're considered to be two very similar eucalypts. So I reckon those juveniles are pretty representative of sparsifolia as described. But just look out for that. But what did it say? 4 millimeters wide. That's already getting wide. That's already getting wider than that. So I think the juvenile to adult phase of foliage is very complicated. And it might just be the first couple of nodes of juvenile foliage that's described by a site like Euclid. But, you know, it's a very difficult thing to sort of monitor and capture and go out and sample and get a concrete idea on what the juvenile leaves are sort of allowed to do. But maybe look for that in sparsifolia and see if you can get these really narrow sort of juveniles. Very different to something like capitulata. And I've gone on way too long, but I'm going to leave it there. And in the next talk, we can just get straight into more species because we've covered all the sort of theory about the Stringybarks. So we'll get on to the beautiful Eucalyptus gleboidea in the next one. All right. Thanks, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. See you at the next one.